I thought I was sort of trapped in a marriage I didn't want to be in.
And he
And
helped you move on.
I thought the man I was married to was God and that he would never let me go. And then
She was born into one of the greatest fortunes in American history, and before she could walk, people were already fighting over her. She spent her childhood as a legal battlefield, her teenage years running from the public eye she had never asked for, and her adult life in a search for love so persistent and so painful that it became the defining thread of everything she did. 4 marriages, 4 children, losses that would have broken almost anyone. This is Gloria Vanderbilt, the dramatic story of her 4 husbands. The poor little rich girl. To understand why Gloria Vanderbilt moved from husband to husband with the urgency of someone searching for something they'd never quite been given, you have to start not with any of the 4 men she married, but with a courtroom in New York City in 1934, and a 10-year-old girl in the middle of the most sensational custody trial in American history. She was born on February 20th, 1924, to Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, a railroad heir with a gambling problem, a drinking problem, and a fortune he was burning through at a remarkable pace, and to the 20-year-old Gloria Morgan, a beautiful woman from a diplomatic family whose primary interest in life appears to have been the social world of Europe. Reginald was 42 when they married in 1923. He was already a man of diminished fortune and expanding appetites, and Gloria Morgan was the kind of spectacular beauty who attracted wealthy older men the way certain plants attract light. When Reginald died of cirrhosis in 1925, his daughter was 18 months old. The family that had built one of the great American fortunes on Cornelius Vanderbilt's railroad empire, the family whose mansions had once lined Fifth Avenue, whose name had become synonymous with Gilded Age American wealth, had now produced an 18-month-old heir, and practically no one in a position of authority seemed particularly interested in her welfare beyond what her trust fund required. The child he left behind was an heiress to a trust fund worth approximately $5 million, and her mother had control of the income from that fund until Gloria came of age. What followed was years of travel. The elder Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt packed her daughter off to Paris, to London, to Monte Carlo, to the beaches of France, always accompanied by a beloved nanny whom the child had named Dodo, Emma Keislich, who became the closest thing to a mother that Gloria actually had. While Dodo raised the girl, the elder Gloria circulated through European society with her identical twin sister Thelma, keeping company that included royalty, aristocrats, and a social set whose behavior was becoming the subject of considerable concern among the Vanderbilt family watching from New York. When young Gloria developed tonsillitis and had to return to New York, her paternal aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a sculptor, a philanthropist, and the woman who would eventually found the Whitney Museum of American Art, suggested the child recuperate in her care at her estate in Old Westbury, Long Island. The elder Gloria readily agreed and returned to Europe. That casual handoff became the opening move in a custody battle that would consume 2 years and produce some of the most extraordinary tabloid coverage the American press had ever generated. Gertrude Whitney went to court seeking full custody of her niece, arguing that Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was an unfit mother. The trial opened on October 1st, 1934, and it was immediately packed with more than 100 reporters who understood exactly what they had in front of them: the richest, most scandalous story in Depression-era America. At a moment when the average family income was $1,700 a year and 20% of Americans were unemployed, a battle between 2 wings of one of the wealthiest families in the country, over a little girl none of them seemed to have particularly noticed while she was in their custody, was irresistible. The testimony was extraordinary. The nurse Dodo gave evidence that the elder Gloria came home intoxicated at dawn, or not at all. A chauffeur described a string of lovers. A French maid described finding Lady Milford Haven, a relative of the British royal family, at Gloria Morgan's bedside. The two women in a pose she described with a specificity that caused such uproar in the courtroom that the judge immediately ejected the press and closed the proceedings to the public. When the newspapers reported what had been said anyway, the story became even larger. Then the judge did something unusual. He called the 10-year-old girl herself into the courtroom in complete privacy and asked her directly where she wanted to live. She told him she was afraid of her mother and wanted to stay with her Aunt Gertrude. The court awarded custody to Whitney. The elder Gloria was given weekend visits and limited summer access. The tabloids published a rhyme summarizing the ruling. Rockabye baby, up on a writ. Monday to Friday, mother's unfit. As the week ends, she rises in virtue. Saturdays, Sundays, mother won't hurt you. The little girl who became known as America's poor little rich girl later said, with remarkable candor, that she had been coached by Gertrude's lawyers on what to tell the judge. She also said that after the trial, her aunt largely lost interest in her as a person, that the legal battle had been as much about the trust fund and the Vanderbilt name as about anyone's genuine concern for the child. And she described her mother, the woman whose custody she had just denied, as a beautiful stranger glimpsed only fleetingly, someone she worshipped from a distance precisely because there had been no real relationship to lose. In the years after the trial, Gloria lived at Gertrude Whitney's estate at Old Westbury, Long Island, and in her New York City mansion, attending private schools, including Miss Porter's in Farmington, Connecticut, and the Wheeler School in Providence, Rhode Island. She was surrounded by cousins and luxury and the kind of structured privilege that looks, from the outside, like a fortunate life. Inside, it was lonelier than that. Gertrude Whitney had largely lost interest in her niece once the legal battle was won, and the nanny Dodo had been dismissed. The one person who had been consistently present for her throughout her early childhood was now gone. Her mother existed at the margins of visitation schedules, still that beautiful stranger. Her father was a memory she had never had. She was, in the truest sense, adrift inside a very expensive and very visible life. She described herself, in the years just before her first marriage, as almost frantic for connection. She said she would have married anybody. She said getting out, away from the court-ordered existence, away from her aunt's declining interest, away from the press that followed her everywhere and had named her before she knew what a name meant, was the only thing she could think about. What the custody battle gave Gloria Vanderbilt was something she would spend the rest of her life trying to recover from. The knowledge that she had been fought over by multiple adults who used her as a proxy for their own interests, and that none of it had been about love. She later described her childhood as having sent her on a restless search for love, and that search would shape every decision she made once she reached adulthood. It would start, characteristically, with a terrible mistake. Husband 1. Pat DiCicco, The Nightmare at 17. In 1941, Gloria Vanderbilt was 17 years old, still under her aunt's control, still technically a ward of the court, and absolutely desperate to escape whatever cage she found herself in at any given moment. Her description of herself at that age was brutally honest. She said she would have married anybody to get out. She just wanted out. That particular somebody was Pasquale DiCicco, known as Pat, a Hollywood talent agent and a man with connections that reached considerably further into the underworld than the entertainment business strictly required. He was 32 years old. He had previously been married to the actress Thelma Todd, who had died under circumstances mysterious enough that questions about his possible involvement circulated for years, though nothing was ever established. He was also a close associate of Howard Hughes and had served in various capacities in Hughes's orbit. They met in Beverly Hills when Gloria was visiting her mother in June 1941. Within weeks, she had decided to marry him. The wedding took place in December of that year, and Gloria walked down the aisle in a Howard Greer gown with a train more than 30 feet long, looking like exactly the kind of society fairy tale that everyone around her wanted to see. The cake topper wore a replica of her dress. The occasion was covered extensively by the press. It was, from the outside, a glamorous beginning. The marriage was a waking nightmare. DeCicco's behavior toward her was abusive in ways that Gloria documented in her memoirs, with a specificity that left no ambiguity about what the marriage had contained. He called her Fatsy Rue, a name designed to make her feel ashamed of her own body, a thin young woman being told by her husband that she was fat over and over, until the word became lodged somewhere permanent. He played psychological games intended to destabilize her sense of her own reality, undermining her confidence, questioning her perceptions. And he was physically violent. She described how he would take her head and bang it against the wall. She came away from confrontations with black eyes. She was 17, 18, 19, 20 years old while this was happening. She was a teenager in an unfamiliar city, married to a man twice her age who had influential connections throughout Hollywood and the criminal underworld, with no family around her who could be counted on to help. She endured 4 years of it before she found the strength to leave. She later described that 4 years as foundational damage, the kind of thing that takes decades to understand and longer to move past, if you ever entirely do. The divorce was finalized in April 1945. She was 21. She had just come into full control of the Vanderbilt Trust Fund, approximately $4.7 million, now entirely hers. She was free of DeCicco. The relief of the freedom must have been enormous, because within weeks of the divorce being finalized, she married again. The next husband was almost everything DeCicco had not been, which in retrospect explains a great deal about why she chose him so quickly. Husband 2. Leopold Stokowski, the legend. 42 years older. Leopold Stokowski was one of the most celebrated conductors in the world. He was born in London in 1882, had built an extraordinary career with the Philadelphia Orchestra beginning in 1912, and was famous not just for his musical gifts, but for his dramatic personal presence. The flowing white hair, the elegant hands, the quality of commanding whatever room he occupied. He had been married twice before, to concert pianist Olga Samaroff, and then to Evangeline Love Brewster Johnson, a Johnson & Johnson heiress, and had 3 daughters from those marriages. He was also, in his 70s, still possessed of a personal magnetism that people decades younger found disarming. He was 63 years old when he married Gloria Vanderbilt. She was 21. The age gap between them was 42 years. She told her son Anderson, decades later, that she had known Stokowski for only a week before she married him 3 weeks after that. The marriage took place in Mexicali, Mexico, on April 21, 1945, barely a month after the DeCicco divorce. When asked, later in her life, what she had been thinking, she offered an answer that was both honest and heartbreaking. She described a kind of mania of escape and hope and desire, the sense that this extraordinary man who wanted her must mean something, must be the love she had been looking for. She had been so damaged by DeCicco, so fundamentally shaken in her sense of her own worth, that the attention of a figure of Stokowski's stature felt like a form of restoration. In the years between the wedding and their first child, Gloria also cultivated friendships and connections that would eventually be written about in her romantic memoirs. relationships with figures including Frank Sinatra, Howard Hughes, and others who moved through the high-altitude world she occupied. She was famous, beautiful, and searching, and the combination attracted attention that she responded to with the eagerness of someone who had been invisible for most of her childhood. They had two sons together, Leopold Stanislaus, known as Stan, born in August 1950, and Christopher, born in January 1952. For a time, the family occupied a particular glamour in the New York social world: the heiress and the conductor, the beautiful young woman and the distinguished elder artist. But the marriage was more complicated than the glamour suggested. Stokowski was a demanding man, intensely focused on his own work and his own standards, and the household organized itself around those priorities. Gloria later described the marriage as having included a nervous breakdown on her part. The accumulated strain of DeCicco's abuse, the rapid remarriage, the effort of being a young mother while navigating life alongside a man who was both remarkable and essentially self-absorbed. He wanted her in the household. She was increasingly restless, creatively ambitious, looking for a life that was genuinely hers and not simply an extension of his. It was during this period that Gloria's therapist encouraged her to express herself through art, and she rented a studio and began painting, writing poetry, and eventually taking acting lessons. Discoveries that would shape the rest of her life in ways she couldn't yet fully see. She made her acting debut in 1954 in a production of The Swan at a theatre in Pennsylvania. And the following year, she appeared on Broadway in a revival of William Saroyan's The Time of Your Life. Acting led to television, and she appeared in live dramas on programs including Playhouse 90 and Studio One. The creative life that had been suppressed during her years with DeCicco and then half-formed during the early years with Stokowski was now expanding rapidly. By the mid-1950s, the marriage had run its course. The divorce was finalized in October 1955. She retained custody of Stan and Christopher. Stokowski was granted weekend visits and summer access, in an arrangement that had a certain ironic echo of her own childhood custody ruling. The legal fighting was civil by comparison with the DeCicco years, but it was still the end of something. She was 31 years old. She had two young sons, a substantial fortune, an emerging creative life, and no particular plan for what came next. What came next, within less than a year, was Sidney Lumet. Husband 3, Sidney Lumet, the director who matched her. Sidney Lumet was one of the most talented directors of his generation, a man who in 1957 would release 12 Angry Men, a film that remains a masterwork of dramatic filmmaking, and who would go on to direct Network, Dog Day Afternoon, Serpico, Prince of the City, and The Verdict. He was born in Philadelphia in 1924, the son of a Yiddish theatre actor named Baruch Lumet, and he had grown up in the world of New York stage performance. He was, in every available description, a man of great intensity, enormous creative ambition, and a New York directness that was both engaging and demanding. He was, crucially, almost exactly the same age as Gloria. They married on August 28, 1956, in a New York ceremony, and for the first time in her romantic history, Gloria was not navigating a vast age gap. She was 22 when she married DeCicco, who was 32. She was 21 when she married Stokowski, who was 63. Lumet was 32 when they married, and she was 32 as well. For the first time, she was choosing a peer. She wore a dress made of French linen, dating from 1830 to the ceremony, an extraordinary piece of textile history transformed into a wedding gown, which was something of a signal about how she was approaching this marriage. She was no longer choosing out of desperation or mania. She was choosing deliberately, with the taste and care of a woman who had been to enough damaged places to know what she wanted. They had no children together. The marriage lasted 7 years, which was longer than either of the previous two, and it ended in August 1963. The accounts of why it ended are consistent in their conclusion without being particularly dramatic in their detail. They were both strong-willed people in a world defined by strong-willed creative people, and the particular combination of their two personalities did not ultimately sustain the marriage through the pressures of Lumet's increasingly celebrated film career and Gloria's own expanding creative ambitions. During those 7 years, Lumet made some of the finest films of his early career, and Gloria was simultaneously developing her painting and her acting work. Two people building two significant careers in the same apartment, in a city that demands everything. Eventually, the math doesn't balance. What endured after the divorce was something more unusual. They remained lifelong friends. Whatever the marriage had not been, it had produced enough genuine respect and affection between two people of comparable intelligence that the end of the legal arrangement did not end the human connection. He was the ex-husband who remained a presence, not an absence. Gloria was 39. She had 3 ex-husbands, 2 young sons, and a life in New York that was filling with creative work. Painting, acting, the early stirrings of the design work that would eventually become her most commercially successful pursuit. And within months of the Lumet divorce, she married for the 4th and final time. The pattern of immediate remarriage had held for all 3 previous marriages. DiCicco, weeks after Gertrude's control lifted, Stokowski, weeks after DiCicco's divorce, and now, again, a new marriage within months of the Lumet split. But this time was different in almost every way that mattered. This time, it was Wyatt Cooper. Husband 4. Wyatt Cooper. The great love and the greatest loss. Wyatt Emery Cooper was born on September 1st, 1927, in Pleasant Grove, Mississippi, into a poor family with deep Southern roots. He had grown up in a world of relatives and extended family, of church picnics and community connections, and the particular Southern sense of belonging to something larger than your individual household. A world he later wrote about with enormous affection in his memoir, Families, a memoir and a celebration. He had made his way to California on ambition and intelligence, attending UCLA and UC Berkeley, working as an actor before finding his voice as a writer, and eventually making his way to New York, where he established himself as a magazine editor and screenwriter with a warm, literary sensibility that owed everything to where he had come from and who his people had been. In New York, he had developed a friendship with the writer Dorothy Parker and her husband, and after Parker's death in 1967, he published an incisive and much-read profile of her in Esquire magazine. He was, in other words, someone with genuine literary intelligence and genuine human warmth, a combination that proved rarer in the world Gloria Vanderbilt inhabited than the surface of that world might have suggested. He was the opposite of the aristocratic world Gloria had been born into in almost every visible way, and he was also, in the judgment of everyone who knew them together, exactly right for her. He was charming, funny, attentive, and possessed of a quality of genuine interest in other people that made him irresistible at dinner parties and even better in private. He loved family in the specific, committed way of someone who had grown up understanding what family was actually for. He was, in every available description of him, a man who knew how to love. They married on Christmas Eve, 1963, 4 months after her divorce from Lumet was finalized. She was 39. He was 36. They moved into a penthouse apartment in New York and became one of the great couples of the city's social life, appearing regularly on national best-dressed lists hosting and attending the kinds of gatherings that defined the cultural world of late 1960s Manhattan. In 1970, the retailer Neiman Marcus invited them to serve as the symbolic king and queen of a European-themed promotional event called the Fortnight, which gives some sense of the position they occupied in the social imagination of the era. They were photographed constantly, and they looked, in all of those photographs, like two people who were genuinely happy. They had two sons, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, born on January 27, 1965, and Anderson Hayes Cooper, born on June 3, 1967. The boy who would grow up to become one of the most recognized journalists in America, anchoring a nightly program on CNN and covering some of the defining events of the early 21st century. By all available accounts, these were the happiest years of Gloria Vanderbilt's life. Wyatt gave her what she had been searching for since the courtroom at 10 years old. He was present. He was engaged. He gave their sons the kind of deliberate, invested fatherhood that she had never received anything like from her own parents. He built a family that felt, in the truest sense, like one. And then he wrote a whole book about why family was the most important thing any person could have. The marriage lasted 15 years. It ended in January 1978, not in a divorce court, but in an operating room at New York Hospital. Wyatt Cooper had had a heart attack in December 1977. He was 50 years old, and his doctors recommended open heart surgery to address the underlying cardiac condition that had caused it. The surgery was performed on January 5, 1978. He died on the operating table, his heart unable to sustain the demands of the procedure. He had not recovered from the surgery long enough to come home. Gloria was 53 years old, Anderson was 10, Carter was 12, and the man who had been the great love of her life, the one who had finally ended the restless search that her childhood had started, was gone before either of their sons was old enough to fully understand what had happened. She told people in the years afterward that she would always think of herself as Wyatt Cooper's wife. She asked her friends and family to address her as Mrs. Cooper until the end of her life. She was buried beside him in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum in Staten Island, alongside their son, Carter. But the losses were not finished, not even close. The losses that defined what came after. In the decade that followed Wyatt's death, Gloria Vanderbilt threw herself into work with the ferocity of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything still to prove. She had been painting and designing for years, and now the work expanded in scale and ambition. In 1976, she had founded GV Limited, her own design company. In 1978, she sold the rights to her name to the Murjani Group and launched a line of products bearing the Gloria Vanderbilt brand: dresses, blouses, sheets, shoes, leather goods, and most famously, the jeans. The Gloria Vanderbilt jeans became a cultural phenomenon. They were high-waisted, made from stretch denim, and they carried her name on the back pocket and a small swan on the inner front pocket, a reference to her first stage role in 1954 in a production called The Swan. The television commercials she appeared in were considered among the more stylish advertisements of their era. By 1979, her jeans were outselling Calvin Klein, Jordache, and Sasson. At the brand's peak in 1980, she was earning $10 million from the jeans alone. It was an extraordinary second act, entirely constructed from her own creative and commercial intelligence, and it made her one of the most recognizable brand names in American fashion history. She received the Neiman Marcus Fashion Award in 1969, well before the jeans arrived. By the early 1980s, the Gloria Vanderbilt brand was generating revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. She also pursued her art seriously, holding one-woman shows in major cities across the country, and she continued to write, producing a stream of memoirs, novels, and poetry that made her one of the more prolific creative figures in American society life. Her romance memoir, published in 2004, It Seemed Important at the Time, described relationships with figures including Howard Hughes, Marlon Brando, Frank Sinatra, Gene Kelly, and Roald Dahl, a cast that read like a catalogue of the most compelling men of the mid-20th century. She had a long and meaningful romantic involvement with the photographer and filmmaker Gordon Parks, who remained in her life until his death in 2006. But she never married again. There was no fifth husband. Wyatt Cooper had been the end of that particular story. And then the financial world caved in. She discovered in the 1980s that her psychiatrist, Christ Zois, and a lawyer named Thomas Andrews, who between them had been given power of attorney over her affairs, had been defrauding her. The lawsuit she brought eventually resulted in a judgment in her favor in the 1990s, but Andrews died before the judgment could be fully collected, and she was forced to sell homes and liquidate assets to cover back taxes that had accumulated while the fraud was proceeding. The fortune that had been fought over in that 1934 courtroom had, by the end, been substantially reduced. Then, on July 22nd, 1988, the worst thing imaginable happened. Carter Cooper, 23 years old, had recently graduated from Princeton and was going through a difficult period, a painful breakup with his girlfriend, an uncertain professional path, the particular vulnerability of a young man who had grown up in an extraordinary household and was trying to find his own footing in the world. He had been in therapy. He had been talking about moving back in with his mother. He was at her apartment on the night of July 22nd, and Anderson has described him in the days before as being in a state of acute distress, disoriented in ways that felt unlike his ordinary self. In the early morning hours, he went into his mother's room. He was unresponsive to her questions, unable to answer clearly, unable to engage with her the way he normally would. Gloria tried to reach him. Then he went to the terrace of the 14th floor apartment. She was right there, present in the moment that no parent should ever have to be present for. She saw her son go over the terrace wall. He was gone before anyone could do anything. She wrote about that morning in a memoir called A Mother's Story, published in 1996. In her telling, she believed that Carter's death had been caused by a psychotic episode induced by a severe reaction to medication he had been prescribed for asthma. That what had happened was not the Carter she knew making a decision, but something else entirely, some physiological crisis that had overridden who he was. Whether that understanding gave her any measure of peace is something only she could have answered. What is certain is that she continued to talk about him for the rest of her life, 31 years, and that she never stopped believing he was still present in some form she could not entirely articulate. She spoke about him openly in interviews decades after his death. She said she still felt him near her. She never used the word closure, which she described as the most terrible word in the English language. Anderson Cooper, 21 years old when his brother died, has described the impact in terms that suggest an entire life reconfigured by a single morning. He became a journalist, he has said more than once, partly because of grief, because loss was a theme he could not stop dwelling on, and his work was a way of living inside that theme without being destroyed by it. His father gone at 10, his brother gone at 21. His mother, who had outlasted all of it, who had been present for losses that would have broken people with considerably more support around them. There was also the financial devastation of the later years, a fraud committed by her psychiatrist and her lawyer, who between them drained millions from her estate during a period when they had been given power of attorney. A lawsuit eventually produced a judgment in her favor, but by the time the legal proceedings concluded, the lawyer had died and much of the money was unrecoverable. She sold homes to cover back taxes. The fortune that had been fought over in that 1934 courtroom had, by the end, been substantially reduced. She died on June 17th, 2019, at her home in Manhattan, of stomach cancer. She had been diagnosed 9 days earlier. She spent those 9 days with Anderson at her bedside, and he was holding her hand and her head when she took her last breath, early in the morning of June 17th. She was 95 years old. Anderson described those final 9 days as the most extraordinary of his life, the most intense and clarifying time he had ever spent with anyone. He later said that being able to spend those days and nights with her was a great blessing, and that the grief of her loss was overwhelming, but also, because of those 9 days, somehow more complete than the other losses had been. She was the last of his immediate family, the last person who had known him from the beginning, and with her death, they were all gone. On the morning of June 17th, Anderson went on air at CNN and delivered a eulogy that was as personal as anything he had ever said in public. He described her as a painter, a writer, a designer, a remarkable mother, wife, and friend. He said she was the youngest person he knew, the coolest and most modern. He said she was 95, but ask anyone close to her, and they'd tell you she was the youngest person they knew. Gloria Vanderbilt was buried in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum in Staten Island, alongside her son Carter and her fourth husband Wyatt Cooper, the great love she had spent the first 3 marriages trying to find, and who had been taken from her after 15 years and left her to carry everything that followed on her own. The 3 of them are together now, in the stone monument of a family that was, in the end, built not by railroad wealth, but by love and loss, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who never stopped believing that the next chapter might finally be the one she had always been looking for. What she left behind. Her estate, when she died, was worth approximately $1.5 million, a fraction of the fortune that had once made her the subject of a national trial. She left it to Anderson. She had spent the rest building things, losing things, surviving things, and making an extraordinary life out of the raw material of a childhood that had begun in abandonment and litigation. She was, in Anderson Cooper's description, the youngest person anyone who knew her had ever known. She joined Instagram in her final years and was astonished to discover that 200,000 people wanted to follow her there. She found it genuinely puzzling that so many people were interested, which somehow only made them more interested. She published memoirs, novels, poetry, and design books across a writing career that spanned more than 4 decades. She gave one-woman art shows in New York, Los Angeles, and cities across the country. She acted on stage and on television and made an appearance on The Love Boat. She launched a fashion empire that changed the American denim industry and generated revenues that a girl raised in a Fifth Avenue mansion could barely have imagined. She co-authored a book with Anderson in 2016, The Rainbow Comes and Goes, assembled from a year of correspondence between the 2 of them that had begun when Anderson asked her to write him letters about her life, letters he could read when she was gone. It became a bestseller. Anderson later described it as a decision he had made precisely because he was afraid of losing her and wanted to leave nothing unsaid while she was still there to say it. She described her 4 marriages not as failures or mistakes, though some of them had contained both, but as expressions of the same fundamental impulse, that when she fell in love, she had always believed completely. The search was real. So was the belief, every single time. What she searched for was something she described simply: love. She had been looking for it since a 10-year-old girl in a New York courtroom told a judge she was afraid of her mother, and the court gave her to an aunt who had slightly more use for her than her mother did, and not very much use after that. She had been looking for it in a city full of powerful and complicated men, marrying quickly and believing fully, and finding, 4 times over, something that either broke her or built her, or, in the case of Wyatt Cooper, briefly gave her everything she had asked for. She found it, finally and imperfectly and at great cost, with a Mississippi writer who had grown up poor and moved to New York on ambition alone, and who knew how to be present in a way that no one else in her life had quite managed. And then she lost him, and she kept going anyway. That was Gloria Vanderbilt. That was always who she was. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.